Okay, I'm going to talk to you about a technique called shellac resist. And that is a technique that you use shellac to paint a pattern or designs onto your work. And then when you wipe off the work with a damp sponge, anywhere that you have painted the shellac will be a raised surface. And so it's kind of a cool technique to, accentuate some brushwork that you might have, or to create some really nice subtle glazing effects later on. And so I will say that this clay or this technique works best in a clay body with either no grog or very fine grog. So typically people will use like a porcelain or some sort of fine clay that clay body that doesn't have grog. And so what you'll do is you'll start with shellac, and you can usually find this in the ceramics studio. Usually we keep it in the back. I've already stirred this up, so I'm just gonna kind of pop off the lid here. And so you don't want to shake a can of shellac. You always just, like I just took it earlier, I took a stick and stirred it up earlier. Also, what you're going to want to do is be able to clean your brush when you're done. So you can't clean your brush with water, so you're going to have to use denatured alcohol. And there's instructions on the side of the can of shellac. And one of the tricks with this technique is you have to make sure, you can't spill it or drip it accidentally anywhere. So anywhere that shellac hits this, this clay, is going to create a raised surface. So just be careful that you're not, dripping the shellac anywhere. And so I'm just going to paint, just some, just different patterns around here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wait for this to dry. And so I will, come back to this video after this is dry. I'm just gonna put a little bit extra on here, and actually just on that one, I'm gonna let those thinner areas, because what it'll do is that'll create a little bit of a different pattern right there. So, and then this particular tile here, I had already put some of the mason stain slip on there. So this is orange mason stain on top of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the shellac over the top of the slip, and what that'll do is it'll make it so that when I wipe the surface off, it'll leave the orange mason stain there. And I'm intentionally allowing that shellac to go a little wider than the than the brushwork that I did with the slip, because I do want to see a little bit of that halo of the white clay around it. So if you don't want that, just paint it on the inside edge, slightly on the inside edge of the brush, the slip that you put on there. And like right here, this would then wipe off the slip, but it would leave your the brush, the different color there. You can also do this process in layers, so you could have another layer of color there, so rather than seeing the white of the clay body, of this particular clay body, you would see the color of the slip. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of finish putting this on there. And then we are going to come back after this is dry, and we'll wipe the clay away. Okay, so I think that's good for now, and we will stop this video and we'll come back when this is dry. Okay, now that we've let the shellac resist dry on these little test tiles here, I'm going to show you how to wipe off the surface so that the areas that you applied the shellac will stay raised. And so the important thing is is the clay has to be dry, like bone dry. And so, you know, this will make it a lot easier to wipe off the surface. And, you know, if it's wet, it's just not very much is going to come up onto the sponge. And the other thing is just to make sure that you dip your sponge in the water often. And because as soon as you start getting clay onto, you know, once you get clay here and then you're smearing it over the top of the areas with shellac, then the clay particles will start to degrade the shellac. And then once the shellac degrades, then you won't be able to, you know, get that raised surface that you're looking for. And so you can already see, that it's starting to be raised now, about, you know, maybe not even the thickness of a piece of paper at the moment. But you can keep doing this, and you just keep going over it, and, you know, do a few wipes like that, and then clean off your sponge. It's nice to be able, you can see this thing is just a little bit too small, so I'm spilling water everywhere. But, you know, do this over the sink, or, you know, with a bigger bucket. And so you can see it doesn't take long for the shellac to start to raise. Now, this might not seem like a lot when you're working on the surface right now, but when you go to glaze that, you can use, you know, a type of glaze that would accentuate those edges. So like, for example, like a Celadon, you know, or something like that, that would be able to show those raised surfaces. And so I hope you can see that in the video. You can see, you know, especially up here, it's already starting to, you know, show a pretty good, nice raised surface. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. Now I'm going to show you the other test piece here in just a second, but, you know, and you could keep going and do as much or as little as you'd like, you know. So that's about the thickness of, say, a piece of poster board. And, you know, the other thing that you might do is just like especially if you have like rounded areas like this, try to, you know, get in there from a couple different angles, and that'll make it easier to, you know, to get that an even raised surface over the whole edge of it. So just for the sake of the demo, I think I'm gonna call this one good, although I probably would work on this just a little bit longer. But I hope you can see the raised kind of surface here. You know, and it's pretty nice and subtle. You can also get some of the sort of dexterity of the brushwork too, with this like thin, or like kind of thin and thick areas, and the variation there, which is pretty nice. So again, just the trick is to make sure that you have your piece is bone dry. Make sure that the shellac is dry. So this was probably ready within a few hours of me coating it, but I have waited overnight for the shellac to dry. Okay, I'm gonna mop up that a little bit because that's getting a little messy. So now this is the one that I did that had color on it. And so I'm gonna do the same thing here, you know, just using the sponge. And you'll see that what's gonna happen is that the areas that have colored slip on them will start to raise, along with a little bit of a halo of the shellac here. And so this is another good way to just accentuate any color patterns or shapes. It doesn't have to be brush strokes here. You know, you could have areas of your work that is, you know, a bigger, you know, more geometric shapes, for example. And so again, the important thing here is that the clay has to be very smooth. So it does not work very well with clay that has a lot of grog in it, for example, just because the grog acts like sandpaper over the shellac. And it'll just start to just cut apart the shellac. And then once the shellac is starting to get ripped apart, then the water from the sponge is going to get in there, and it will start to, you know, just it'll start to lower the areas that you don't want to be lowered. And so you can already kind of see you know, the raised surface that's happening here. So it's creating this little sort of peninsula of white clay, and then of course the brush stroke in the middle. Now that yellowy kind of color, that's from the shellac, and that'll just burn off in the kiln, so you won't see that yellow halo. So that's about it. I think if this weren't on this video, I would probably just work at this a little bit longer. And you know, here is a good example right here of the area that you can see that I painted the shellac on the inside edge of the brush stroke. And so that means now that color comes right up to the edge there. So if you're looking for something that looks a little bit more like a true kind of raised brush stroke, then that's probably a better option for you, you know. But in this case, I just wanted to show you a couple different options. The other thing is that, you know, make sure you have a little bit more water than this. You can see that the water is getting a little bit cloudy with clay, and it's making it harder to clean this sponge. So the trick is just a really nice clean sponge. And but you can see there the depth and everything of that brushwork. So so just experiment with this. Remember that, you know, nice smooth clay. Make sure you don't drip that shellac anywhere, and anywhere that you don't want it. And then and experiment with how deep to wipe that surface down. You know, you can go really deep. You could alternate it on different parts of the work. So maybe part of the work has a really deep sort of valley here, and then other parts is much more subtle. Like you can see this area here is much more subtle, but this area is getting a little bit more defined. So so that's shellac resist, and just experiment and have a good time.